In episode 1, we introduced the Christ myth theory and the academic consensus on the historicity of Jesus. And in episodes 2 and 3, we talked about the primary sources used when discussing the life of Jesus of Nazareth. In this episode, though, we're finally going to look at the history of the Christ myth theory, from its origins in the Enlightenment to its resurgence in the 21st century on the internet. Let's get started. The earliest known mythicists were a pair of French writers, Constantin-François de Chassaubeuf, Comte de Volnay, and Charles-François Dupuy. I'd apologize for butchering those names, but they're French, so I'm not going to. In the 1780s, Volnay went on an expedition across the Ottoman Empire, stopping in Egypt and Syria in order to learn Arabic. While on this journey, he took notes, which he eventually published as Travels in Egypt and Syria in 1788. He was also a member of the Estates General and the National Assembly after the French Revolution broke out in 1789. Inspired by the revolutionary zeal of the era, Volnay would publish his most famous work, The Ruins, or A Survey of the Revolutions of Empires. The book gives a prediction that at some point in the future, all religions would merge into one after they recognized the universal truth underlying all of them. As a side note, the first English translation of this was actually done by Thomas Jefferson when Volnay visited Monticello back in 1796. But due to the book's anti-Christian tone and the election happening that year, he did not want his name attached to this project, and so he refused to translate the chapters of the books that had the anti-Christian tone and asked that his name not be attached to the translation. Working alongside Volnay and very much influenced by his work was Dupuy, who had studied astronomy and mythology, which led him to publishing his most notable work, Origin of All Cults, or Universal Religion, in 1795. This work was so influential that it was one of the motivating factors behind Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Volnay and Dupuy both believed that Jesus was not a historical figure, and that Christianity was an amalgamation of other Near Eastern mythologies. This would give birth to what I refer to as the comparative religion methodology, which focuses on comparing stories and themes found in early Christian literature with other ancient religions. Those who use this methodology believe that the existence of similarities is enough to believe that there was some kind of spiritual plagiarism. And if one thing is plagiarized, then everything else must be plagiarized as well. Ergo, Jesus didn't exist. This methodology would become the most popular, despite the fact that it is also the weakest, but we'll cover that more in a later episode. The comparative religion methodology would continue its popularity in the following decades, but it would have to rebuild itself across the English Channel. Due to both Volnay and Dupuy being associated with the head-chopping French Revolution, their works would have little influence outside of France after the fall of Napoleon. But in the 1830s, it would re-emerge from the mind of Godfrey Higgins in his work Anacalypsis. Higgins studied the law but was never permitted to practice it, and when Napoleon threatened to invade the UK, he joined a militia up near York, and retired in 1808 at the rank of major. He was also a political reformer, advocating for the abolishment of child labor, better treatment for people in insane asylums, as well as calling for the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. It was later in life that Higgins became interested in ancient myths, along with serving as a member in several neo-Druid organizations at the time. In a 3-volume work called The Celtic Druids, he argued that the beliefs and practices of the Druids came from Indian priests, who he also believed had built Stonehenge. Higgins would die before finishing his final work, Anacalypsis, which was supposed to be a history of all religions, which he believed all originated in India and Atlantis. Around the same time we saw the rebirth of the Christ myth theory in England, we saw it emerge in Germany, but in a very different form thanks to the work of Leopold von Ranke. Von Ranke revolutionized the field of history by putting an emphasis on using primary sources and differentiating them from secondary sources. You can learn more about von Ranke from this video by The Cynical Historian, but suffice it to say that von Ranke made the next methodology of the Christ myth theory possible. Along with von Ranke's standardization of historical study, we also need historical criticism, also referred to as higher criticism, which is a field of studying ancient religious documents for their historical context as well as the historicity of the events described in them. One of the first writers to put these methods into practice on the person of Jesus was Lutheran theologian David Friedrich Strauss, whose work, The Life of Jesus, critically examined, was the first biography of Jesus that didn't assume his divinity, and treated the New Testament documents skeptically, especially when it came to miracles. Strauss himself was not a mythicist, but his writings would form the ground for future mythicists, including ones that had attacked him, such as Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer had been a student of Hegel, and in the 1830s he led an attack against Strauss, who had criticized Hegel's methodology in The Life of Jesus and Other Works. Bauer would first attack the historicity of Jesus in 1841 when he published Criticism of the Gospel History of the Synoptics. Bauer didn't outright say that Jesus never existed, but that the Gospels are an irrelevant source for learning about him. At this point he could be described as a soft mythicist, but by the 1850s he would enter the hard mythicist camp by publishing Criticism of the Pauline Epistles and a critique of the Gospels and the history of their origins. Bauer was not very influential during his lifetime, but since his death he has become more influential among mythicists. Between Strauss and Bauer, we see the birth of what I would call the source criticism methodology of the Christ myth theory. This methodology focuses on questioning the reliability and authenticity of the primary sources discussed in episodes 2 and 3. Bruno Bauer continued to contribute to the Christ myth theory into the 1870s when he published Christ and the Caesars, where he argued that Christianity was a syncretism between Roman Stoicism and Jewish mystery cults, which falls within the realm of the comparative religion methodology. But at this time, we've finally seen an American begin to contribute to the Christ myth theory, Percy Graves. Born in 1813 to Quaker parents in Pennsylvania, Graves' early life is full of uncertainty. Some sources claim that he had no formal education, and others claim that he had an academic education. Regardless of what kind of education he had, by the age of 18 he had become a teacher in Richmond, Virginia. In the 1840s he spent time living in utopian communes, and experimenting with many new religions, but eventually abandoning religion altogether. His contribution to the Christ myth theory came in 1875 with The World's 16 Crucified Saviors, where he compares the story of Jesus in the New Testament to figures in other mythologies. This book heavily borrows from Anacalypsis, though he never cites Higgin or anyone for that matter, and that's something you'll find very common amongst 19th century mythicists. Back in England, we have another mythicist contributing to the comparative religion methodology in the 1880s. Gerald Massey. Gerald Massey was a poet who claimed to have taught himself hieroglyphics by spending a lot of time at the British Museum. His first book on the Christ myth theory, The Natural Genesis, was published in 1883, and it made the claim that the story of Jesus was a retelling of the story of Horus, which is a claim you will find a lot among mythicists. Just like Percy Graves, Gerald Massey was also heavily influenced by Higgins, and also like Graves, he never cited Higgins, despite the fact that all three of them tell the same stories in almost the exact same way, and none of them are citing sources to back up their claims. Around the turn of the century there was a resurgence of mythicism. British anthropologist Sir James George Frazer published the first edition of the Golden Bough in 1890, which looked at religious traditions around the world, and it became very influential amongst mythicists, despite the fact that Frazer himself was not a mythicist. This became such a big issue for Frazer that in the 1913 edition of the book, he had to state that his theory assumed the existence of a historical Jesus. In 1900, a Scottish member of the UK Parliament, John Mackinnon Robertson, argued that Jesus never was a living person, but rather a new deity made up by a first century Jewish messianic cult to pray for harvests. And he used sources from the Talmud to back up his claims. There was also the English schoolmaster George Robert Stowe Mead, who in 1903 argued that Jesus of the Gospels was actually referring to a character from the Talmud who was executed about a century earlier than Jesus was believed to have been crucified. These and others gave birth to the third major methodology of the Christ myth theory, the literary reinterpretation methodology. This methodology focuses on reinterpreting old documents to mean things that they weren't traditionally thought to have meant. A common argument from these mythicists is that the Pauline epistles were not referring to a flesh and blood Jesus, but rather a spiritual or allegorical Jesus. But the biggest name among mythicists at this time was German scholar Arthur Drews, who published the Christ myth in 1909, contributing to the comparative religion methodology. This work was so influential that for about the next decade, you had actual theologians debating whether or not a historical flesh and blood Jesus is necessary for Christianity to be considered a true religion. Some argue that you didn't need a flesh and blood historical Jesus for it to be true, but those who did quickly lost their orthodox credentials. Ultimately, Drew's book was rejected by both theologians and biblical scholars. However, the book is still used by mythicists. Mythicism would remain pretty quiet during the 20th century, living on mostly in the Soviet Union, where it remained part of the Communist Party line at Soviet universities until the 1970s. But just as Soviet universities were abandoning the Christ myth theory a British professor would revive interest in it within this English-speaking world. In 1975, George Albert Wells would publish Did Jesus Exist? Wells was the professor of German at London University, who wrote extensively about German intellectual history. Aside from Strauss, Bauer, and Drews, there were many writers from 19th century Germany that wrote on the Christ myth theory, but due to the language barrier, these ideas did not go far outside of Germany. This meant that the source criticism methodology remained, and up to now largely still is, dominated by German scholars. Wells didn't contribute much in the way of new research for the Christ myth theory. Rather, what Wells did was introduce mythicist texts and ideas to an English-speaking audience that didn't have access to them before. He continued this path with his later publications, such as The Historical Evidence for Jesus in 1982 and Who Was Jesus? A Critique of the New Testament Record in 1989. Wells passed away in early 2017, and by that point his position on the Christ myth theory had evolved. Back in 1975, he was a hard mythicist, believing that there never was or could have been a historical Jesus. But by the time of his death, he had slid into becoming a soft mythicist, believing that there was a historical Jesus, but that the New Testament had nothing to do with him. Unlike most mythicists I came across, Wells was the only one that modified his thesis with every criticism it received, which ultimately led to his final position on the subject. After Wells, we get other writers whose primary contribution to the conversation is introducing older ideas to a new audience. In the 1990s, we get Robert M. Price, who has the notable distinction of being the only mythicist with a PhD in New Testament or biblical studies. Price's major contribution has been the reintroduction of the literary reinterpretation methodology. Price's rendition of it argues that the Gospels are actually a form of Haggadah Midrash about a Jewish wisdom figure described in the Talmud and the Old Testament. But if you look into Price's bibliography, he has done far more for the mythos of H.P. Lovecraft than he has for the debate over the historicity of Jesus. Alongside Dr. Price, we also have Richard Carrier, who got his start as an editor for an atheist activist group. Carrier has the distinction of being the only mythicist to have ever had a PhD in ancient history. His recent contribution was an attempt to disprove the historicity of Jesus through Bayesian theory. I still don't know which methodology that this would fall under, but my best guess at the moment is source criticism. More and more modern mythicists try to fuse all these methodologies together, but what this ends up doing is that their books don't really have enough evidence to support any of the arguments at all. But finally we get to the 21st century, and although books continue to be published on the subject, the biggest driver of the Christ myth theory today is the internet and documentaries. Starting in 2005 with The God Who Wasn't There, exploding with Zeitgeist the movie, and continuing with the most recent release, Batman and Jesus, the Christ myth theory continues to exist despite all evidence to the contrary. Now this of course is not an exhaustive history of the Christ myth theory, but rather a timeline of the biggest points that anyone familiarizing themselves with the subject should know. So if you're interested in learning more about the Christ myth theory, I have listed my sources down in the description below, and amongst those sources you will find some affiliate links to Amazon, where if you buy those books or anything else through those affiliate links, it will financially support this channel. I would like to thank my generous patrons for helping me make this video possible, especially my executive producer, Leo Hawkhauser. Thanks to your support, I can continue to make these videos to educate and entertain. If you would like to know more about becoming a patron, then you can go to patreon.com/GrantHurst to learn more. You can also get perks such as getting to see videos early, as well as getting your name in the end credits of videos. If you enjoyed this video, then you should click the subscribe button and the bell icon to make sure you never miss a new one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.